Small-town Hewitt, Texas. The unthinkable. Two beautiful young boys burned alive in a backyard shed. It all looked like a horrible accident. But as the days and months wore on, something else was about to emerge. What exactly happened to those precious boys behind the house on Angel Fire Drive?
Joby and Jason and I were just best buddies. We loved our time together. Jason was just full of energy, had a personality that would light up the room. Joby was more serious. Very rarely did Joby and Jason ever fight. And Joby always took up for his little brother. They were best friends.
Claire Bradburn is the boy's mother. Life was good. Claire was a single mother working as a teacher, trying to make ends meet. They seemed to be the typical American family. That is, until that one hot summer day. What happened on that Tuesday in August?
It was a typical Tuesday morning. We got ready for school. The boys came in the bedroom, and we had a wonderful, strong hug. And then I was at school, and after a day of working and having meetings, the principal came into my room and said I needed to go home. There was a fire in the storage building behind the house.
As Claire approached the house, it was utter chaos.
I saw all the streets lined with people. Emergency vehicles there already. People already with tears and had their hands up by their face, and I had this knife in my heart.
When Claire got to the front door, she was informed of the unimaginable. 9-year-old Joby and 8-year-old Jason were trapped inside the storage building. Claire's husband, Ed Graf Jr., was the one who delivered the devastating news.
I immediately asked Ed, "Where are the boys?" He said, "They're gone." And I specifically said, because gone where? And he said, "Joby and Jason are dead."
When Claire met Ed Graf 3 years before, she was a single mom, struggling to raise Jason and Joby on her own.
Ed was a pillar in the community. He worked at a local bank, very responsible.
Ed treated Claire like a princess. It looked like he might be her Prince Charming. A year later, they decided to marry. Claire got pregnant after only a few months, and Ed adopted Jason and Joby. Their life seemed perfect. But Claire soon found out Ed wasn't exactly the man he pretended to be.
He'd been embezzling money from the bank for 12 years and was fired for it.
And with the baby on the way, their blended family started fracturing.
He was very excited about this baby, but my kids were being pushed out of the picture somewhat.
After the birth of their baby, Edward III, Graf took out life insurance policies on all 3 of their sons.
$50,000 life insurance policies. In the event of accidental death, they would double.
While Ed doted on his newborn son, his relationship with Joby and Jason turned. The boys' personalities changed anytime Ed was around.
They seemed to me like they were scared to death of him.
Claire was getting scared too.
I felt like I needed to leave. Ed told me I would never take his son away. At that moment, I knew that this was some serious business, that was a threat.
A few weeks later, Claire's world changed forever.
I ached, my heart, my whole, I physically hurt inside.
As soon as she walked in, Ed Graf said, "We've lost both boys." Now, I don't know how he knew that because I hadn't told him that. We said that we found a body, our child, not his son. We didn't say we didn't know who it was.
Her sons were dead, and Ed's reaction to it seemed odd.
I walked in and I saw Ed first and I tried to hug him. And I said, "I am so, so sorry." He said, "It's okay." He said, "Things do happen," which was very unusual.
And Ed's explanation of what happened left more questions than answers.
Ed said he was inside the house during the fire, changing the baby's diaper. He didn't hear the people beating on the front door.
That same terrible night, so Claire wouldn't have to look at the charred remains of the shed, the volunteer firefighters had it loaded up and taken away to the local dump. The fire was ruled accidental, but a mother's intuition was not to be ignored.
I knew he was behind it in some way.
A fire in a storage tool shed in Hewitt late this afternoon claimed the lives of two brothers, aged 8 and 9.
Days after the funeral, Claire and her family were suspicious. They went to talk to McLennan County District Attorney Vic Feazell, hoping to convince him to investigate the fire that killed the boys. Investigate he did, and by the end of it, Vic knew what he had in front of him.
We had a long list, maybe 20 things, enough to convince me that Ed Graf was a murderer of these two children.
Two young boys burned to death in their own backyard shed. But the tragedy soon looked just like murder, and all fingers seemed to point to their stepfather, Ed Graf Jr.
I felt he was responsible for murdering Joby and Jason.
But what kind of monster would kill his own sons? Cops and prosecutors believed Ed Graf was monster enough.
The eeriest thing about all of it was the address where it happened, 505 Angel Fire.
10 months after the fire, Ed Graf Jr. was arrested and indicted for the capital murders of 9-year-old Joby and 8-year-old Jason. If Ed was found guilty, he could face the death penalty. At trial, the prosecution alleged that Ed Graf somehow knocked out the boys, carried them to the shed, then set it on fire. And they believed they had fire science on their side.
There was enough evidence to see where the burn marks were, the floors. That was an accelerant. The doors were closed to the shed. My feeling was it was not accidental.
One of the firemen, he took a picture of the debris. So we had fabulous photographs to work with.
Former McLennan County District Attorney Vic Feazell brought in two nationally renowned fire science experts to review the photos and testify. Those experts believe the door to the shed was closed. Two fires were intentionally set, an accelerant was used, and the boys were found on their backs in relaxed positions, which indicated they were unconscious. They apparently never attempted to protect themselves or get out. Their conclusion: it was a clear-cut case of arson. But adding more heat to the case were other circumstantial pieces pointing at Graf's involvement.
There were some things that Ed did that didn't seem weird at the time, but then later became odd to me.
There was the boy's cereal and medications he didn't buy.
He's always so organized and everything's so methodical. The refilling of certain things, our food, the prescriptions.
And the new school clothes he didn't let the boys wear.
He didn't want to shop for school clothes. Then we did go, but he didn't want them to take the tags off. And he wanted to place the whole sack in our closet, and that was odd.
Days after the fire, Ed returned the clothes and got his money back. And then there were the insurance policies Ed took out on the boys.
We heard allegations that Ed had embezzled money from the bank he had worked from before. And that then became what I felt was the motive for getting the insurance policies on these little boys.
As soon as the insurance policies were effective, within days is when he committed the murders.
Ed continued to proclaim his innocence and reportedly had answers for everything. He said the insurance policies were a way to save money for the boys' college. He kept the tags on in case the clothes didn't fit. Ed's defense? The boys accidentally set the shed on fire. And there were a lot of people who believed in Ed's innocence.
I think he has a winning personality because he had at least 20 character witnesses come testify on his behalf. I think Ed is a sociopath.
When I was testifying, Ed did look at me and stared, just kind of stared at me. It was his intimidation. I had no problem looking at him, looking right back at him.
As the case went to the jury, no one felt 100% confident.
Did you ever feel this was a slam dunk case against Ed Graf?
Oh, heck no. No, it was not a slam dunk case. It was, it was a circumstantial case. Almost no case is slam dunk. Look at O.J. Simpson. He should have been convicted and they let him go.
After hearing 3 weeks of testimony and spending only 4 hours deliberating, the jury came back with the verdict.
When the jury said the guilty verdict, it was just a relief. It was some peace.
Guilty. Ed was convicted of capital murder. The sentence, life in prison. He narrowly escaped death, unlike Joby and Jason. And that's where the story would normally end. Not this one.
Graf's case is being re-examined, and so are others in which defendants were sent to prison for setting fires based on expert testimony about burn patterns or charring that is now considered suspect.
22 years after Ed Graf went to prison, the Innocence Project partnered with the Texas State Fire Marshal's Office to conduct a review of previous arson convictions. Ed Graf's case was one of the cases the Innocence Project believed warranted attention.
If the original investigators had looked at the photographs objectively and seen, they would have seen that there was not any forensic evidence there to support their conclusions.
2 years later, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals said the scientific testimony used to find Ed Graf guilty of arson has been proved false.
I was at some of the hearings. It was just sort of like opening the wounds again.
Claire's heart nearly stopped. After 25 years behind bars, Ed Graf was granted a new trial.
All I can tell them is that, I didn't do it.
Coming up, for Claire, justice for Joby and Jason had become a never-ending fight.
There was a hush over the room. We knew, knowing Ed, we knew there was a plan.
Well, I would say I wanted my freedom more than anything.
Claire Bradburn thought justice had been served for the tragic and shocking deaths of her 2 young boys, 9-year-old Joby and 8-year-old Jason.
I loved them, and I tried to treat them like my own. It's a terrific loss, all those things, and especially all at one time. It's a heavy burden.
Her ex-husband, Ed Graf Jr., was sentenced to life in prison for the appalling crime, burning down the family shed with his 2 stepsons inside. In an exclusive prison interview, Ed Graf spoke with John Carroll from our affiliate KWTX.
You didn't put the boys in there forcefully, close the doors, either lock it, padlock it, or whatever, and start the fire.
No, sir.
And you didn't kill Jason and Joby?
No, sir.
But in a cruel twist of fate, Ed Graf was granted a new trial after the fire science used to help convict him in the first trial was deemed junk science.
There was no evidence that I did it. I wanted my freedom more than anything.
Trial number 2 was going to be full of twists and turns and would have an outcome nobody could have imagined. McLennan County District Attorney Abel Reyna knew retrying Graf was going to be tough, but he was ready.
Essentially what you've done is taken a case that was originally an arson case and basically you're pulling it out and just making it a murder case. You're now relying on purely circumstantial evidence, but there was a lot of it. And I felt confident that we had the ability to obtain a conviction on Mr. Graf for murder.
The prosecution may have felt good about the circumstantial evidence, but the fire testimony this go-around looked like a win in the defense's column. Fire investigator Thomas Singh was originally brought in during the appellate stage.
I was hired by the McLennan County DA's office. They were reviewing the Edward Graf case. I analyzed that fire. The DA subsequently did not call me to the court, but Walter Reeves, the defense attorney, did.
Singh said in his report that because the shed had been taken away the night of the fire and investigators worked only from photographs, there was no way to conclude if the door had been opened, closed, or even where in the shed the fire started. Singh also said there were multiple reasons for how the fire could have started and why the boys didn't get out, all of which brought him to rule the fire's cause undetermined.
You shouldn't be able to convict someone on speculation. Do I think he did it? Personally, I do not.
And with Ed Graf still proclaiming his innocence, the defense decided to stick with the same script. The boys accidentally set the fire. For Reyna and his team, the fight to keep Graf locked up was personal.
I'm a twin. Jason and Joby reminded me They remind me constantly of my brother. I think that was always in the back of my mind. These brothers would not have laid down and let each other die. And that's the garbage that Ed Graf wanted the world to believe.
After 2 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. A few hours later, a note was sent out saying that the jury was deadlocked 10-2. Was it 10-2 to convict or 10-2 to acquit? With lengthy deliberations and the possibility of a hung jury, the defense team started negotiating a plea deal. Then, as the verdict was about to be handed to the bailiff, something happened that sent shockwaves through the courtroom.
There was a hush over the room. We knew, knowing Ed, we knew there was a plan.
And was there ever a plan? Ed Graf changed his plea from not guilty to guilty, admitting for the first time he killed Joby and Jason. The judge sentenced Graf to 2 60-year prison terms to run concurrently.
The possibility of a deadlocked jury and having to come do this all over again in another year, and I think he just made the decision to enter a plea now and end it.
It's what everybody had been hoping to hear for a very long time.
The feeling that the courtroom had when Ed Graf finally admitted guilt, to me, was a career moment, because Ed Graf had lied to the world for 3 decades.
Ed Graf's biological son, who had been a baby at the time of his brother's murders, took to the stand to talk directly to Graf.
You are not a father. You are not a man. May God have mercy on your soul, because no one on this earth should.
Despite the feeling of relief, there was about to be a second detonation of shockwaves from Graf's plea of guilt. Just 2 weeks after confessing to killing his 2 stepsons, Ed Graf walked out of prison a free man.
By admitting guilt, Graf was able to take advantage of a little-known Texas loophole called the mandatory release law. Claire's worst nightmare became a reality.
Part of the plea for Ed was not only that he confessed to murdering Joby and Jason, part of the package was that he would be able to get credit for the years that he had already served, so that he would be eligible for mandatory release.
Mandatory release law was enacted primarily to help alleviate prison overcrowding.
The Texas law states if a felon committed a violent offense between 1977 and 1987, that person can be released from prison after time served and good time credits total at least a third of their initial sentence.
There was nothing that can be done to prevent the automatic release of a double murderer of 2 young children. And if that doesn't hit home for you as to the serious nature and the flaws of this law, I don't think anything else will.
Some wonder if Ed Graf fully knew if he pleaded guilty, he would quickly grab himself a get-out-of-jail-free card.
If it was a strategic move, then it was a good one, because the jury was going to return a guilty verdict.
Prosecutors aren't buying it and say Ed Graf's release is not only an injustice, it's a license to kill.
I feel that Ed Graf will always be a danger to society. I mean, when you really think about the moments when he's putting them in the shed and he's killing them, I don't think you can ever fully trust someone who's capable of doing that.
Graf is out of prison, but he couldn't escape our Crime Watch daily cameras when we tracked him down in Kerrville, Texas, on his way to work.
Ed Graf, Jason Matera with Crime Watch Daily. How does it feel to be a free man?
Get out of my face, dude.
Get out of your face? How come you haven't shown any remorse? Why did you kill those boys? Mr. Graf, don't you think you should give Claire closure? Mr. Graf, come on, we know you hear us. Don't you think you should give some sort of an explanation why you killed Jason and Joby? Why'd you burn the shed?
Claire will always live with the pain of losing her boys.
Words can't express how much I miss the boys. My children are buried here, but they are with me every day.
There's a part of her that feels responsible.
I have guilt over the fact that I brought the boys into a marriage with this guy. and they called him their father. And he turned on them like a viper.
And now in Kerrville, Texas, a confessed killer walks free.
If there's one thing I could say to Ed, is that his true judgment has not come, that he will be judged again one day for his deeds.
It seems almost impossible that a convicted killer could be set free right after confessing to his crime. To get some perspective on that, I want to bring in now former criminal trial prosecutor Lonnie Coombs. The obvious question here, how could this loophole possibly exist?
Well, let me set your mind at ease. The loophole no longer exists. However, it was the law in Texas back in 1986, which is when this crime occurred, so that's the law that applied. The thing that happened here was, at the time of his sentencing back in 1988, he actually got a life sentence. When the new trial occurred and he got this chance to make another plea bargain, he pled not to life again, but now to 60 years concurrent on 2 different charges. That sounds like a lot of time, but the 1986 law applied, and now because he had a specific set sentence of 60 years, he got credit for his time served, plus good behavior time. He was allowed to just walk out of prison.
What about the recourse in this case for the boy's mother? Is there any?
Unfortunately, not really. Now, usually victims can bring a civil lawsuit. In this case, it would be a wrongful death claim. But in Texas, the statute of limitations is only 2 years, so she can't bring a civil lawsuit either. However, it's important to note that the mother of these 2 boys said even though she thinks it's a travesty that he's out walking the streets, she was still satisfied with the plea bargain because it allowed her to finally hear him, after all of these years, stand up in court and say, "I'm guilty. I'm the one who killed your 2 boys." And that's peace of mind for her.
It is such a sad case, Lonnie, and I'm really grateful for you taking the time to explain the legalities to us. Thank you.
Thank you.